Let's begin our day 3 with very first concept constructor. The question is, what is constructor? The answer is constructor is a special member function or special method of a class. Constructor have same name as its class name. We cannot define return type for constructor and constructor cannot explicitly call. These all rules are associated with constructor concept. But the question is why these rules are defined for constructor. Why we are saying that constructor will always define with the same name as its class name. Why we are having this rule that constructor cannot have any return type. Why we are having this rule that constructor cannot explicitly call. Let's try to understand why those rules are defined for constructor. To understand this, we first have to understand how object creation internally works in Java. And for that reason, I am using this graphical representation so that you will have some understanding of object creation in Java. So let's begin with this. We have a keyword called new. New keyword is used to create object in Java, right? But the problem with new keyword is new keyword doesn't tells the compiler that for which class you want to create the object. For example, in a class A, if you are just writing new keyword, compiler will never know that for which class you want to create object because association is also there. Inside class A, you might be want to create object for class A or might be for class B or might be for class C. So just telling to the compiler by writing the new keyword is not enough. You must have to mention the class name as well. And that's the reason syntax says that every time whenever you will create object using new keyword, just after new keyword, you must have to mention class name. For example, if I want to create object for temp class, I need to mention new temp. I want to create object for demo class, I need to mention new demo. So that compiler will accordingly create object for that particular class. If I am saying new temp, compiler is going to create object for temp class and will assign instance data members of that class to that object. Similarly, for demo class, it will assign A, B, C, three variables to that object of ABC class. So every time it is going to create the object inside heap. But for which class you need to create the object, you must have to mention just after new keyword. Now let's suppose I want to execute some common task on each object creation. Okay, for example, I have this method. This method I want to execute on each object creation. So I need to define the calling of this method every time for each object, right? So for example, I'm defining the calling for the first object. And then similarly, if I want to again create temp class another object, then again I need to define the calling for this method. So instead of doing this thing, they said, okay, let's do one thing. Instead of defining the method with a different name, if we will define the method as same as its class name, then it will be more convenient to define the calling of method every time whenever object will create. That's the reason I have changed this method name and switched to class name. And instead of defining that method calling separately, I am defining the calling of this method this time. Okay. And this is how this calling is mainly doing two tasks. One is it is working like an indicator telling to the compiler that I want to create the object for temp class, so that compiler will create the object for temp class and assign the instance variable of temp class inside that object. Secondly, it is also making the call of that method which is going to perform common task on each object. Now let's suppose I don't want to perform common task on each object creation. In that case, I also don't want to have this method in my class. Now the problem comes. When you will create the object like this, there you are defining the calling of that method which is not available this time in your code. And because this is not available, then it will start giving you error. So how Java deal with this problem? I'm taking another scenario to explain you this. Okay, let's suppose I'm creating two objects of temp class. Okay, and for both of the objects, because belongs to the temp class, x and y memory will be allocated for each object. I'm assuming that 1000 is the address of first object and 1200 is the address of second object. Now let's suppose if you want to access x memory or y memory for first object, you must need to access the address of first object, that is 1000. Similarly, if you want to access y or x of second object, you must need to access the object address of second object. And this rule is applicable for each object of temp class. If you want to access any instance data member of any object of temp class, then you must first have to access object reference. Then only you will be able to access instance properties that are placed inside that object. Now how you will access that address? You don't know the address. Object is created by JVM internally, and JVM only knows that object reference. So how every single time you will get the object reference? And Java come up with a solution to overcome this problem. They says that okay, every time whenever you will define a class, you must have to have a constructor within your class. In that constructor you can define that common task that you want to execute on each object execution. And whenever this constructor is internally called by JVM, because JVM already have created the object for that class, JVM knows that object reference. So what JVM will do, JVM will return that object reference from that constructor. So for example, if you are saying new temp and the object will be created by JVM internally, JVM will take that object reference 1000 and return that reference from the constructor itself. So you will receive that object reference wherever you are defining the calling of that constructor. For first object creation, you are going to receive 1000 by the constructor here itself where you define the calling. Similarly, for second object, you will receive 1200, which is the reference for second object. So every single time, whenever you will create the object, constructor will execute and JVM will return the object reference from your constructor to the same place wherever you are defining the calling of constructor. And in that way you will receive that object reference, and once you receive that object reference, you can use that reference to access instance data member that are inside that object. Okay, now that's the reason they define this another rule, that you are not allowed to define the return type for constructor, because constructor is already returning an object reference. And as you know that in Java or in any programming language, you cannot return two values at same time from a method. So you can't return two values from this constructor as well. And because it is already returning object reference, you are not allowed to define return type for that constructor, and you are not allowed to define any return value from the constructor. And you can't even define the calling of constructor explicitly. Like you always have to define the calling of constructor while creating the object, because the timing of execution of constructor is fixed. It will be always when object will create, right? So while object creation, constructor is going to be execute, and for that reason you must have to define the calling while creating the object only. You cannot call it explicitly like a normal method. That's why these rules came, that constructor have same name as its class name, because constructor name work like an indicator to compiler, telling to the compiler that we want the object for this particular class. Similarly, constructor doesn't have any return type, because constructor is having by default class type of return type, because constructor is by default returning object reference. And the third one is constructor cannot explicitly call, because constructor always execute while creating the object. So calling of constructor definition is fixed. You cannot call it anywhere explicitly. And because these three rules are specifically applied for this method, this constructor method, that's why we say that constructor is a special member function of class, because it is having different type of rules that are not applicable for normal methods.